Air quality matters inside our buildings and out. And we already have many of the tools we need to make a difference. The conversations we have and how we share this knowledge is key. I'm Simon Jones, and this is episode 34 of the Air Quality Matters podcast. Coming up, a conversation with Corrine Mandine. She has been working on the human exposure to chemical substances and physical agents and its related health effects for years. For 8 years at the French National Institute for Industrial Environment and Risk, and then for 13 years at the CSTB, the French Scientific and Technical Centre for Buildings. At the CSTB, she coordinated the French Indoor Air Quality Observatory, a public research programme created in 2001 to carry out national surveys on air quality in buildings. And in 2022, she joined the French Institute for Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety, where she leads the Radiation Epidemiology Group. This group conducts research on the human health effects of occupational, medical, and environmental exposure to low doses of ionizing radiation through large epidemiological studies. She's been involved in various European and international projects and expert committees, including at the WHO and the European Joint Research Centre. She is currently chairing an expert committee dedicated to outdoor and indoor air quality at the French Agency for Food, Environment and Occupational Health and Safety. I couldn't think of a better person to talk to about epidemiology and its place in the air quality discussion. We discuss this fascinating area of science, and if you've been following the podcast, you know we've had several conversations about the potential of an air quality observatory in the UK, and Corinne has direct experience of just this. In her current role, she is also involved in a major study on radon, another subject of interest for me personally. So I couldn't wait for this chat, and I think you'll enjoy it too. Thanks as always for listening. Do check out the sponsors in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net. This is a conversation with Corrine Mandine. So we'll start with the epidemiology question, because I think we use that term a lot, particularly on this podcast, because of the kind of guests we have on. But also it's framing increasingly the discussion around air quality as we make increasing links between air quality and health outcomes. But I'm not sure I've ever really discussed what epidemiology really is and what it is to the built environment and particularly air quality. And I can't think of a better person to ask than you, Corinne. So perhaps maybe just give us the 101. What is epidemiology and how does it fit within this part of our environment, the air quality piece?
It's a study of the disease in a geographical area and over time. So a descriptive evaluation of the diseases, human diseases. And moreover, epidemiology is also the study of the human disease determinants, trying to understand what are the causes of the disease that appear in humans. Is it genetic causes or is it environmental causes? So epidemiology is a science of understanding the diseases. That's why it's very important for environmental health, because it's the understanding the determinants of the diseases. Is it occupational exposure? Is it domestic exposure? This is what epidemiology tries to understand. So it's one of the fundamental science to understand, for example, the effects on humans of chemicals or of physical agents or of biological agents. There are two main disciplines. There are toxicology, experimental toxicology. In a lab, you control everything. You expose your chemicals to cells. You expose cells to chemicals, or you expose animals, mice, for example, rats, to chemicals. And then you see the type of effects that appear on these cells or on these animals. So with toxicology, you control everything. That's why it's, in a way, it's better. You control, you know that exactly the quantity of the chemical you expose your animal to. But it's not representative of human. This is not life. Experimental animals are not humans. So that's why epidemiology is coming. This is the second main science to understand the effects of chemicals or other risk factors. In epidemiology, you study the humans themselves, so you are close to the real life. You are not simulating anything. You observe the reality. But the counterpart is that it's very difficult to control everything. It's very difficult to understand all the chemicals to which people are exposed to. Imagine that to explain a disease appearing in the population now, you need to know what the people were exposed to across the course of their life since they are born, and even before, because we know that in utero exposure may have an effect on health when you're a child or an adult. So epidemiology is real life, but it's very complex because you need to reconstruct, to rebuild the exposure, and that's why it's not so easy to be used. It's challenging. Epidemiology was largely used regarding ambient air quality, outdoor air quality, because when you have outdoor air quality is monitored, there is a regulation, is regulated, so you have a fixed monitoring station. So once you measure a concentration of PM2.5, for example, or nitrogen dioxide outdoor, you have the exposure of millions of people around, thousands of people around. But regarding indoor air quality, it was more challenging because every room, every dwelling is different. So doing epidemiological studies for indoor air quality has been hard, and it is limited to date.
And will it always be limited by that? Is that just a fundamental factor of epidemiology in general? Is that depending on what you're trying to understand, there will be more or less confounding factors? And do you reach a threshold at some point where it just becomes impossible to draw conclusions? It's just too complex a picture to understand.
Yeah. Sometimes when you are studying a rare disease, it's very hard because you need large group of people to observe a rare disease. That's why there are different types of epidemiological studies. There are what we call the ecological studies. In ecological studies, you are not looking each person in the group of population. You are just you're having a group on a geographical area, and you compare the diseases that are reported in this area and the exposure outdoor air quality, for example. But you're not studying each person. So ecological studies are more easy to perform, to carry out, because you're not going to each person. You're just looking at a geographic regional area, for example. But it's limited because you don't control what each person is doing. If the person is smoking, for example, if it has genetic factors, for example. So ecological studies are limited, so that we tend not to use ecological studies anymore. So the two other types of studies are cohort studies. So you have a large group of people and you follow them over time. You describe their exposure over time, and some people will become sick and some other will not declare the disease. So at the end, after 10 years of follow-up, or sometimes more, 15 years of follow-up, you compare the exposure of those who have become sick and those who have not become sick. And you try to understand if those who became sick have had specific exposure, specific chemicals or specific biological agent, compared to those people who did not become sick. So it's the cohort studies. The limit is the cost, and because you need to follow a large group of person over a long period, so it's very expensive, and sometimes people are disappearing. You lost them if they move, for example, or if they decided to stop the study. So the third type of epidemiological studies are the case control. In a case control study, you recruit the people who are sick, so that these studies are used for rare disease. So for example, you go to hospitals and you recruit people having lung cancer, and you pair each of these person with what we call a control. A control is somebody who has the same age, approximately, the same sex, and the same socioeconomic status. And then you have this case, the people with the disease and the control. Sometimes you have several controls, up to 5 controls per case. And then you compare their exposure. do people with lung cancer at 40 years old, a man with lung cancer at 40 years old, what was his exposure to radon in the past? And you try to understand based on either measurement or modeling. And you compare with the exposure of the person, the same man, approximately same age, with no lung cancer. And you try to understand if he was exposed to radon. This is how we discovered that radon was causing lung cancer, because observing a group of people with lung cancer, it was observed that they were more exposed to radon over their life compared to people without lung cancer. Taking into account their tobacco status, of course, because we know that tobacco is also causing lung cancer. So the case control studies are cheaper or easier to perform once you know if you have a disease, a specific disease to study. No, the challenge in epidemiological studies is to characterize the exposure. Ideally, the best is to measure personal exposure, having people wearing sensor or doing a urine measurement or blood measurement. But we know that first, this is expensive. And second, second, this is very intrusive. It's not easy to have a blood sample of thousands of people. So if you cannot measure personal exposure, you measure exposure in the ambient air. This is what is done for outdoor air quality. For indoor air quality, also radon, the cohort studies, the case control studies on radon, people were not wearing dosimeter. There was a dosimeter in their house, and this is how we measure indoor concentration, and this indoor concentration is the exposure concentration. But even measuring in the ambient air, indoor air is expensive. Sometimes is difficult when you need to have a pump to sample air. It's not easy. You need to send the sample to the lab, so it's expensive. So the third option is having questionnaire. You ask people, for example, if in epidemiological studies of children having leukemia, you ask to the parents if they were exposed to cleaning products when they were younger, or if they were exposed to pesticides. Is there a field with pesticide used outdoor, based on questionnaire? But the limitation, I would say, is that there is the bias of memory. You don't always remember what you hit last year, what you did 2 years ago, where you traveled a few years ago. It's hard to remember, and people who are sick tend to remember differently. That if you're not sick, you forget. If you are sick, you try to you imagine that maybe these things you eat or this product you used in the past could be the cause of your disease. So there is limitation with questionnaire also. So you see, it's very challenging to perform epidemiological studies, but this is why it's interesting.
Yeah, because out of those three kind of approaches, the ecological, the cohort, and the case study, there's 1,000 questions around each of them that immediately spring to mind, because it's so fraught with difficulty. Is it fair to say then that epidemiology is a relatively new science, or does it go back in some form quite a way? And if it's new, do we understand enough about it to understand what is a good study and what is a poor study now? Do you know what I mean? Because I imagine it's the quality of epidemiological studies must be really important, and because it's so investigative, there's so many confounding factors potentially.
Absolutely.
A poor study could be really poor, and a good study could be very good, or you could just be lucky, you know?
Yeah, this is sometimes when you have large group, you make many statistical tests, and some tests are due to chance. It's by chance that you observe some relationship. That's why there are some indicators in epidemiological studies. There is what we call the p-value. The p-value is a sort of indicator that say if it's just by chance that you observe something, or if it's not, it cannot be due only to chance. So there are some indicators, and this p-value there is a limit, generally 5%. And if you have multiple tests, this value is evolving to take into account that if you do multiple tests, you may just observe an association by chance. So this is taken into account, And coming back to your question about the if it's new or not, it is not new basically, because it was discovered by John Snow in the UK in the 50s. He observed that people having cholera were people close to a specific wells. That's why he discovered that there was an association between the distance to a well contaminated and the diseases, and that this is the first studies that were performed in last century. But it is not new, but it's improving with new techniques to characterize human exposure, from questionnaire to measurement in the in the environment, to now personal measurement. And what is developing more and more is human biomonitoring. The European Commission is promoting human biomonitoring, measuring in the urine or the blood. You directly have people exposure, provided the contaminants can be measured in urine or blood.
And I suppose the larger the data set, the more chance you've got of finding something you couldn't imagine. Because I imagine there must be a part of this is stuff comes out of these studies that you weren't expecting. And there you have to really check the difference between causation and correlation and things like that. But I'm guessing the bigger the study, the more chances are you find a pattern or something that tells a story.
Actually, the bigger it is, the more variables you can take into account. Because if you have a small group of people, you take into account those who smoke, those who live close to a road or not close to a road. Then you make some categories, and the more categories you have, the smaller is the number of people in each category. And you cannot do anything regarding statistics if you have small groups in different categories. So it needs to be large to have enough group of people, enough smokers and not smokers, enough different ages. So that's why you need large group of people. But you raise an important point between correlation and causality. Epidemiological studies generally allow to us to identify some association or correlation between a risk factor and the disease. But it does not mean there is a causality. There can be a third variable that was not studied and that is connected both to the exposure and to the disease. That's why we still need to date some experimental studies in the lab to understand on cells or on tissue or on animals the mechanism. And once the mechanism is plausible between the risk factor and the disease, the causality is confirmed. But generally, we observe association, not causality. So this is something that people generally don't know, and sometimes some epidemiological studies may conclude things that is not causal. That's why we need also to understand the biological mechanism to be sure that the risk factor is explaining a disease.
And is that why you hear the term epidemiological and toxicological studies talked about together so much? Is that they go hand in hand often? That either you understand something toxicologically and you try to find that pattern through epidemiological studies, or the other way around, you see a pattern or something in an epidemiological study and you ask the question, is there a cause there that we've found? And you would use the toxicological studies then to figure out, is that plausible? Is that why you hear the two mentioned together so often?
Ideally both needs to discuss together to understand the mechanism or to check the mechanism that can be plausible. It's not easy, everybody is in its own discipline, and sometimes not easy to break the silos. But when the public agencies then make a study on a given chemicals or biological agent, they compile all the data from biological data from experimental studies and epidemiological data. Anyway, at the end, EPA or a group in the European Commission, both data are useful to do risk assessment. For example, when coming back to indoor air quality, today there are indoor air quality guidelines that are values that are used to interpret a result. When you do a measurement, if you want to know that this concentration, is there a risk for the people breathing this indoor air, you compare the measured concentration with a guideline, indoor air quality guidelines So WHO, the World Health Organization, has proposed some guidelines for chemicals. These guidelines are based on health data, either from toxicological studies or from epidemiological studies. So this is the example where both disciplines, the results of both studies are used to set these guidelines. So what I forgot also to mention, a lot of, we mentioned epidemiological studies in general population, but there are specific epidemiological studies on occupational group of workers. And some information that we know on benzene, for example, or on solvents are from epidemiological studies done in plants, in industrial plants, or done on workers, not only on general population. Because workers are sometimes exposed to specific compounds. That's why it's easier to identify a correlation between a disease and the compound if all their career they were exposed to asbestos or to benzene or to given pesticides. The information on health effect of pesticides are largely from epidemiological studies in workers, showing, for example, relation between glyphosate and health effects in workers. So sometimes this data observed in workers can be extrapolated to general population.
How do you, as an epidemiologist, map out the idea of an epidemiological study? Because I imagine if you've got a good imagination and an understanding of a particular discipline, you're starting with a blank piece of paper and you go, I think this might pose a risk, or I've seen a toxicological study that says there might be this impact. And then you have to sit down and think, right, okay, how do I frame this? Not on just the three different types of epidemiological studies, but like you say, is it on a particular cohort within a particular industry, or on a particular industry within a particular area, or in a, at some point you've got to try and understand how best to create what could be quite an expensive undertaking to get a result that's valuable. So I imagine as an epidemiologist, you must have to spend a lot of time figuring out what it is you're trying to ask, what the question is, and how to do that in a way to get something meaningful out the other side. I imagine the structure is incredibly important in that.
Exactly. You mentioned the good word, the question. What is the initial question? Do we have a question on a disease? Do we have a question on a risk factor? For example, in a cohort study that is ongoing in French daycare center, the question at the beginning was that we observed respiratory disease in people who are cleaning workers in hospitals, cleaning workers in offices. They have more asthma. So the hypothesis was that these people have more asthma because of, among other reasons, because they are using cleaning products. Cleaning products have a lot of chemicals inside, and disinfecting products may have biocides. So we observed this in workers. So we had the idea, is it the same in children? Because we observe more and more asthma and respiratory disease and allergies among young people, among children. So the initial question was, can we observe, is there a link in daycare center where there are a lot of use of cleaning products? It must be clean. The parents want that the daycare center are very clean. So in this specific environment, do we have the same, could also the cleaning products be associated to asthma in children? That's why we set a cohort study. We recruited by random selection 100 daycare center in Paris and around Paris. And then we recruited the children. We asked the parents, do you agree to... So there are a lot of authorization to obtain before leading an epidemiological study. So then we asked the parent, do they want to participate? And once we had all the authorization, we did measurement of indoor air quality in this daycare center. And in parallel, we collected health data with the parents. Not the children are too small to fill in the questionnaire. So we had an initial question: is asthma observed in children due to cleaning products, especially cleaning products used in the daycare center? And for another epidemiological studies we are carrying at RSN, my institute, there is in France the Constance cohort study. Constance cohort studies is a group of 220,000 French people randomly selected 10 years ago. We agreed to participate in this cohort, and so all these people are now, there is a follow-up of these people, and these people are regularly asked to provide information through questionnaire. So we are working on radon and trying to understand the effect of radon. So we had the idea of, okay, let's use this large cohort to ask all these people where they lived over the course of their life, and we will assess the radon exposure all throughout their life, which is unique, which has never been done today. And we will see if disease that we observed in this group of people now could be associated with radon exposure in their childhood. So here the initial question was more an opportunity, having this large group of people. Okay, let's add radon to this study, and let's see if radon could be associated with the health effect that these people are reporting, and taking into account, of course, all the other exposure. That's why it's difficult. We need to take into account chemical exposure, biological exposure, physical exposure. So yeah, at the beginning, you need a question related to a disease or related to a risk factor. So a disease, asthma or dementia, or neurological development, or a risk factor, a pesticide, radon or asbestos, and like that.
And I imagine it must often be the case that epidemiological studies lead to further epidemiological studies, lead to further, that you find a pattern and you go, we must look at this in this way, and that creates a new study. And like a lot of academia, further research and further investigation.
This is often the conclusion. Further studies are needed, and sometimes we have new ideas and new hypotheses came when we are doing the study. So that's true. Sometimes larger studies can be performed, and the epidemiological study, as I mentioned, on daycare center was performed only in Paris metropolitan area. We could imagine having a larger cohort at the scale of France, for example, or a country.
Yeah, I imagine data quality and data labeling must be really important in epidemiological studies, especially because I imagine the meta studies, the studies that look at the studies and try and find patterns and things like that, that if there's good rigor behind how information is collected, how it's sorted and managed, and air quality being a classic example of that, that I imagine future generations can be using the data collected from current epidemiological studies and thinking of things that we haven't thought of, or combining data sets, a new data set with an old study. Is there quite a bit of that goes on, that kind of joining up?
Completely. About the data quality, this is fundamental. If you don't have good data, you don't have good results. So this is fundamental. And sometimes the founders often forget that we need data managers. We need people cleaning the data and checking that the data are reliable. If questionnaires, sometimes people answer with contradictory responses. So we need to clean everything, maybe to call back the people to check the answers. So this is always long. This is why epidemiological studies are sometimes long because of sometimes the follow-up, but also long to clean the data, to check that they are reliable, to exclude sometimes some people in the sample. So data cleaning is fundamental. And yes, now we observe that there is a large wave of data sharing, making data as openable as possible and as confidential as requested. So there is a trend to open sciences. So the idea is really to share the data and to be able, if people want to reuse them, to as far as possible. Sometimes the limitation with epidemiological studies is that we are working on health of people, health data on health. Data on lifestyle factors are considered as sensible data regarding the the GDPR, General Protection Directive, the regulation on data protection. So there is also this issue to be addressed, that this is confidential data. We need to be sure not to identify any people when we are sharing data, and we need anonymize the database, for example. But there are many epidemiological studies in the world that are available, that can be used again in the future. For example, there was a European study on indoor air quality in schools and health stages of children, called the Symphony studies. This database is now not available online, but available upon request to the coordinator. If any research team wants to use the data, it's possible.
Yeah, I had this conversation recently. It was at an indoor air quality observatory meeting, which was the first one I didn't see you at, which was a shame. But I was talking to the guys that manage the Born in Bradford study, which is a big cohort study that takes in very sensitive data of people's health and their careers and criminal records and social welfare and, everything.
Huge amounts of data.
But the point was made to me that the most sensitive databases that you can imagine are already being managed quite securely anyway. So actually, it's mostly about structure and how you access that. And, GDPR isn't as big a barrier as you'd think, because we already collect a lot of incredibly hypersensitive data, and there are already institutions that have very high levels of trust associated with the management of that data. So it can be done. It can be done.
Of course, it can be done. So it requires a bit of effort and energy to have all the authorization to do it and to share. But now, for sure, there is solution now where you have the data on a secured cloud, and you can access the data distantly, and the data can remain totally confidential. It's possible, of course, but it's something that people who wants to start an epi studies or to use data from epidemiological study have to keep in mind this data protection.
How closely linked is social science to epidemiology, do you think? My instinct is there's quite a bit of crossover, certainly on the behavior and habits and impacts that might have an impact on epidemiological outcomes, I'd have thought.
Yeah, you're right. We need to include more and more human sciences in our epidemiological studies. We need to, as we said earlier, and we need to break the silos, to have more communication between hard sciences and human sciences. Because when I was doing some studies at the French Indoor Air Quality Observatory, we were working with people from human science to build a questionnaire, because sometimes the way we ask the question must be very neutral, not to induce the reply, not to make that the people understand in a wrong or correct way. So the questionnaire, if the epi studies is based on questionnaire, the questionnaire must be very well done, to be understood, to be neutral, to be not intrusive. So this is important among other topics. These human sciences are important on this aspect.
So you've started to describe, I think you've described very well epidemiology. I've learned loads out of that. You hear it's a name that's thrown around a lot, but I don't think unless you're in that field, certainly it's mind-meltingly complicated. I guess it must be quite multidisciplined in its nature, epidemiological studies. Very difficult to undertake with a very narrow focus.
Yeah, but we need statisticians to manipulate all this big amount of data, but also people, the health professional to work with them when we are recruiting people in a hospital. Yes, this is very multidisciplinary. If there are some analysis in a lab, we need people doing chemical analysis or other type of analysis in lab, or analysis in urine or blood, having people developing methods to be able to measure new pollutants, because sometimes I was mentioning the epi studies in daycare center. We know that some chemicals, the quaternary ammonium are related to asthma. They are suspected to be related to asthma. But today there are no analytical technique to measure quaternary ammonium in settled dust. They are not volatile, so they are mainly not in air but in settled dust. That's why we had to collaborate with a lab to develop the technique to be able to measure this compound. So we need to involve many disciplines, absolutely.
From an epidemiological perspective, how have we started to see that science applied to the subject of this podcast, which is indoor air quality predominantly? You said it's difficult because we don't necessarily have the big data sets that we have with outdoor air quality monitoring, but it started, I'm guessing at a cohort level and so on. We're starting to see the results of indoor air quality epidemiological studies.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier radon. There were many case control studies on radon in Europe, in European countries, and then a joint study of all the case control cohorts. Case control studies in Europe were merged together. This is a study from Sarah Darby who showed clearly the relationship between lung cancer and exposure to radon. Some similar studies on radon were performed in the US, in China. So radon has been largely studied in epidemiological study, maybe because radon is easy and cheap to measure. It's a dosimeter that costs about 20 euro. It's passive. You just put the dosimeter in the room. You don't touch it during 2 months, and it's easy in a way. There were some epidemiological studies on mold and asthma. So mold is difficult to measure in air or on surfaces, but mold is visible. So not all mold are visible, but if as soon as you have visible mold or visible dampness, many studies, epi studies performed in Scandinavian countries have shown clear relationship between mold and dampness in buildings and asthma, especially asthma in children.
Yeah.
And WHO has written a report on mold and dampness in building. There were epidemiological studies on nitrogen dioxide and respiratory disease in children. Nitrogen dioxide can also be measured rather easily with passing samplers, or nitrogen dioxide is also directly emitted by a gas cooker. So some epi studies based on questionnaire, do you have a gas cooker in the kitchen? Yes, no, and I simplify, of course, but some studies, either based on measurement of NO2 or based on questionnaire, if people had a gas cooker at home, showed the relation with asthma or other respiratory disease in children. There were a little bit of studies with formaldehyde showing a relation with asthma. Some studies shows, especially a study from Carl Gustav Bornehag published in 2004 was a bit new. It showed a relation between phthalates. Phthalates are chemicals used in plastics.
Yeah.
They are plasticizer to make the plastic be smooth and soft. And phthalates can be released little by little by these products containing phthalates. So we find there are a large number of chemicals that can be more or less volatile. Some are present in indoor air, some are present in settled dust. And this study carried out in Sweden showed a relation between DEHP, a phthalate in settled dust, and asthma in children. And the study was repeated in Bulgaria also. What is important, what I can add is also that one epidemiological study does not give the answer on a relation between a risk factor and the disease. We need more. We need a large number of epidemiological studies. We need a weight of what we call the weight of evidence. Having several studies showing the same result give stronger power to the results. If you have only one study, it's not enough. Of course, you need to be able to repeat and to observe the same relation. So, replying to your question, yes, there are some epidemiological studies on indoor air quality, but less than the epi studies performed on outdoor air quality. The good news is that with the new techniques of low-cost sensors arriving on the market, there are more and more. We will be able in a few years, maybe already now, to measure in many places because it's cheap. in any rooms also because it's cheap, and on a very large time scale, because when you are measuring radon, you need to measure during 2 months. So you have one concentration over these 2 months. So you don't have evolution over time. So for radon, it's not a problem, but for other VOCs, volatile organic compounds, that may not be, for which the concentration is not very stable, depending on consumer products you use, cleaning products, it's good to have the temporal evolution over the time, over the season. And with the classical standardized methods, either passive sampler or active sampling during 1 day or 2 days, we don't have this temporal evolution. So we are not able to study very in fine way the relation with diseases, respiratory disease, for example, and indoor air pollution. So with these low-cost sensors, I think, in my opinion, this is a great opportunity to have more epidemiological studies in more buildings for affordable prices. So provided these sensors are, of course, reliable, they are not, they have no drift over time. They need to be able to characterize specific VOCs. To date, these sensors are measuring total volatile organic compounds, which is a controversial indicator. So, but it's a good way so this is a way of improvement for the epidemiological studies, this low-cost sensor. Another promising tool is the machine learning and all these sophisticated models that are more and more used. If we have more data based on the sensor, there are techniques to analyze this data. So this is also very powerful. And so
I imagine low-cost sensors, as much consternation as they give to a lot of scientists and academics because of accuracy and drift and what they're actually measuring and algorithms and interpretations that go in on the back end, all that stuff. For epidemiological science, because you often have scale in numbers or time, it lends itself much more to that type of technology where I'm not saying you don't need the accuracy, but quantity can overcome some challenges you might have with accuracy sometimes, because you can remove outliers and 90th percentiles and all of that good stuff. You know, all the statisticians can get their hands on it and do good stuff with it. So I imagine low-cost sensors really lend themselves well to large-scale cohort studies, or even the ecological studies where you put them into an area or put them into a particular cohort over a long period of time. Much more valuable than the very precise lab-type studies that you might have in other parts of science.
Absolutely. Sometimes in some studies, we just need to classify people if they are highly exposed or exposed, not exposed, or in the middle. So this is true. Sometimes we don't need the accurate value of the concentration of a given risk factor, because we are not characterizing the place, the environment, and we are not comparing to a guidelines or a mandatory value. We just want to classify people and in groups of exposure. So this is true that sometimes relative value is sometimes enough, provided that all the sensors have the same behavior. But if they all have the same behavior of overestimating or underestimated, maybe for some epidemiological studies it's not a problem, provided we're able to identify the more exposed and the low exposed or not exposed. Exactly.
There's two questions I want to come back to, which I mustn't forget. But I imagine at the pace at which epidemiology moves at, which I think is quite slow because of the size and scale often of the studies, and the pace at which technology is moving at the moment, it must be incredibly frustrating sometimes that you finish a 5-year study or something and look back and think, damn, I wish that sensor had been around 5 years ago when I was imagining this study, or even back 10 years ago, some of the stuff you were doing in the Indoor Air Quality Observatory, how different a picture you might have been able to paint with the tools you have available now. And I imagine sitting down now, knowing that, trying to imagine how to pull these studies together, God knows what could be available halfway through that study at the moment. The way AI is moving and the way sensor technology is moving at the moment.
This is what is exciting. If we could have regret, but we must see the future and not the past, and imagine more exciting and studies, for example. I was mentioning the low-cost sensors to measure the concentration in the environment, but smartphone apps can also be useful. For example, for the cohort studies we had in daycare center in France, we were asking to the parents every month if the child has some diseases over the past months with a notification on smartphone and 2 questions. So it's very easy. It's not a big questionnaire of 30 pages, and it allows the longitudinal follow-up for the studies. So the new technologies can also help to collect easy mass of data very easily, not only the concentration in the environment, but also the behavior you were mentioning and all health events, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people would have been exposed to that for the first time during COVID with a lot of the apps that they were asked to feed information into. I mean, the one we had in Ireland, you were encouraged every day to log on and tell it whether you were feeling well today or not, and if you weren't feeling well, what your symptoms were, and so on and so forth. And those kind of apps make it incredibly easy to give longitudinal feedback in real time of symptoms and feelings and activities or certain behaviors. It's phenomenal, really.
Exactly, and the smartphone itself allows to identify where are the people, are they in which city or where are they located. So it's also used for epidemiological studies for looking at in outdoor air quality to track where the people are and to follow their the way if they were walking or if they were in their car. It can also be used in that sense.
Yeah.
Another source of data that is new is the health claim, the records, the medical records. Medical records in many countries are used to reimburse people when they pay the doctor or they pay the drugs. But these data are recorded and can also be used to identify the diseases of people. And we are at RSN, my institute, we are starting using this massive data for our participant of cohorts after having the authorization of the ethics committee and all the committees allowing us to do that. For the person of our cohort, we have access to his medical claims. So we are able to, instead of using a questionnaire to ask people, do you have diabetes or do you have other type of diseases, we can look at the medical records and identify in the records over the past years if the people had asthma 2 years ago or diabetes or had a surgery for cataract for the eyes, for example. And this is very powerful also. It's complicated to treat, to manipulate. We need specific statistician to do that because it's a massive amount of data. And it's different database to compile and to cross, but it provides very useful information on health, on the diseases of the people.
And do you think large language models and AI are going to increasingly facilitate this type of large-scale data set manipulation and characterization?
Yes, also probably because sometimes it's based on text, so we need to use this text mining information to retrieve the information. So for sure, this AI is very powerful to help future studies.
One of the things I made a note, which I meant to ask you, was it seems to me that epidemiology is, because of its scale and its kind of population health level lens, it's one of the sciences that's most closely aligned to policy, I would have thought, because sometimes some science can be so niche and so specific. It seems such a very long way from outcomes, from political decisions or regulatory decisions or something like that. But because of the nature of epidemiological studies, the DALYs and direct correlations to cost to health, or those kind of things that enable policymakers to make decisions, it seems to me to be a science that's very close to the decision making at a population level. And that must be quite exciting, that if you can present a very strong case or present a very strong idea, you're almost presenting it in a way that enables the people at the levers of power to make an impact, to change a policy or regulation or a process to get a better outcome. That must be quite nice.
I would say yes and no. Yeah, the example of yes is, for example, all the radiation protection regulation worldwide is based on the epidemiological studies that were performed after the bombing in Japan, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. The survivors were follow up over many years. There are still follow up of what we call the lifespan study, and all the information from these epidemiological studies were used to set the frame of the regulation on ionizing radiation, directly from the epi studies to the regulation. But no, in a way, for chemicals, for example, the European chemical agencies, ECHA, for the regulation of chemicals, most of the data provided by the industrials are chemical substance by substance, and most of the time they are based on experimental data, experimental studies on animals. So for chemicals, the regulation for substances, pesticides or biocides, most of the rational data used by regulators are experimental studies. For the outdoor air quality, the regulation on outdoor air quality is based. There will be a new directive signed soon, and based on the WHO proposal, WHO guidelines, and these guidelines are all mainly based also on epi studies. You're right. So it depends on the topic, but
depends on the topic. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the low emission zones in cities have been driven through both large scale environmental data and epidemiological data, and actually there's some real rigor behind some of those decisions as to where to put low emission zones into cities. I mean, it's a really good example of an application of that kind of science, which is really exciting.
It's hard at the same time to identify, sometimes in epi study, to identify one risk factor. That's why this is what we were discussing at the beginning. Experimental studies in the lab where you control everything. You have one chemical and you understand the effect of this chemical. Epidemiological studies, it's good, it's the mixture and the real life, but at the same time, sometimes it's hard to identify one specific pollutant associated to the health effect that you are studying.
Just going to grab your attention for a minute. I wanted to quickly tell you about Lindab, a partner of this podcast. For over 60 years, Lindab has been dedicated to improving the climate of buildings. I have known them and some of the great people who work there for as long as I have been in this industry. Lindab offers a broad range of products, from individual components to complete indoor climate solutions. Their systems not only promote better indoor environments, but also deliver economic benefits. If you're working on a new building project, Lindab's high air tightness products and demand-controlled ventilation systems are designed to meet the stringent energy efficiency requirements of today and align with environmental certifications. If you're renovating, Lindab's smart units can upgrade existing systems, reducing energy consumption by up to 70% with minimal impact on the building structure. Lindab's products meet the certification standards for BREEAM, LEED, DGNB, and many more, ensuring optimal environmental performance. And if you're looking to simplify your design process, their range of ventilation software and tools make product selection, calculation, and performance evaluations quite straightforward. Creating healthy spaces is at the core of Lindab's mission, which is why at Air Quality Matters, we are so pleased to have them as a partner with this podcast. Do check them out in the podcast notes at airqualitymatters.net and, of course, at lindab.ie. Back to the podcast. How did you find yourself getting into epidemiology, Corinne? Is that something you studied? And did you take that with you into the Indoor Air Quality Observatory? Maybe give a little background as to your journey into this field, to where you are working today. I think it'd be really interesting for people.
No, I'm not an epidemiologist by background. I'm a chemist, environmental chemist. I studied organic chemistry and exposure to chemicals. But when you are studying human exposure, you rapidly come to epidemiology and association with health effect. That's why I arrive on the epidemiological studies and leading a group of epidemiologists. But I'm passionate with trying to understand environmental determinants of human diseases. That's why I arrive on epidemiology. I'm personally more passionate with human studies than studies on experimental animals. So that's why I arrive on this topic.
There's an investigator in there in you. I think there's a lot of that in scientists. If they hadn't been scientists, they'd have been inspectors or investigators or something. That you're looking for. You're asking questions the whole time, and you're trying to understand the why.
And there are so many diseases today that are increasing, like cancer in children, or allergy, Alzheimer's disease, many diseases that we don't know we don't fully know the causes. So it's important to understand if there is an environmental component, environmental determinants explaining these diseases, to be able to, if we understand, if we know, to be able then to prevent from, to raise awareness among people if they need to adjust the behaviors, provide knowledge for the policymaker to regulate. So this is what I like to contribute to, a part of contributing to better knowledge of these environmental determinants.
And listeners to this podcast would have heard us mention a couple of times, we've had Henry Burridge and Kath Noakes and a few others on talking about this idea and concept of an indoor air quality observatory. But you've lived that. I'd love to get your take on the kind of the birth of the Indoor Air Quality Observatory in France and practically what that meant during your tenure there, what an Indoor Air Quality Observatory does or could do.
Yeah, so the French Indoor Air Quality Observatory was set in 2001, so more than 20 years now. At that time, there was a big crisis in France around asbestos, because we knew that asbestos was toxic, but it was banned very late. It was banned in 1997. So the policymakers at the end of the 90s in France wanted to have an independent research group collecting data, neutral data, disconnected from the industrial stakeholders to describe indoor air pollution. That's why the observatory was set in 2001, to provide knowledge. And the main objective of the observatory was to collect data regarding indoor air quality, but not only, or regarding noise in buildings and temperature, also thermal comfort. And at the national scale, so the data were collected. The added value of an observatory is to collect data at a large scale, and if possible in randomly selected buildings, schools or dwellings. If you do random selection, you will look at you have a diversity of situation. If you're based on a voluntary basis, you may have the best and the worst, those who are aware of the problem and those who are in difficult situations. So having a large monitoring across the country with random selection of building provides a huge amount of data, and this knowledge can be used for many things. It can be used for first to provide references. We were discussing a bit earlier during our talk about the indoor air quality guidelines proposed by WHO or by different countries. These guidelines based on health data to know if it's exceeded, you may have the disease appearing in the people. So it's to interpret the concentration. But unfortunately, these indoor air quality guidelines are very scarce today. We have thousands of chemicals in buildings, but only about 20 indoor air quality guidelines. So for the pollutants who don't have any that don't have any indoor air quality guidelines, having the distribution in dwellings, all the dwellings in France, or all the schools, or all the offices, help the people doing measurement to interpret the results. If you say you measure the value of 10, but you know that the median value of this pollutant is 20 in dwellings in France or in Germany, you can tell to the people in this office or in this dwelling, you are below the median value observed in the housing stock, so it seems it's okay for you. On the contrary, if you measure 30 microgram per cubic meter and that the median value is 20, you can say to these people or the building owner, you are over the median and maybe you are over the 95 percentile. So it helps by default. If you don't have sanit health guidelines, it helps to interpret the measured concentration. So the observatory provided for 20 VOCs for the first campaign and more over the time, this distribution of concentration in French dwellings, in French schools, in French offices. So it is very helpful then for people doing measurement, a municipality doing measurement in a school, or a building owner and doing measurement in an office building to interpret, to know where the measurements can be situated compared to the full stock of buildings. So it's used for that, to providing reference value, reference distribution. Since when you're collecting massive data, we were collecting also descriptive data on the buildings, use of concentration materials, the outdoor environment of the buildings, the activities of the occupants of the building. So collecting all these descriptive data make possible to identify the determinants of some concentration. I had a few, for example, in schools here, we identified that the classrooms having plastic flooring had more phthalate in settled dust and more phthalates in indoor air. So we identify a source. Having this large sample, this allows, as we were mentioning, to avoid not to have confounding factors. If you have a large group of buildings, you have diversity, and you can identify these determinants. So the flooring, we identify in dwellings that if you have an attached garage, you have a higher concentration of benzene and toluene. If you have an attached garage, you have either your car with exhaust gas, or you have old paints, old varnishes. You put everything in your garage, and all these solvents may still emit and may contaminate the house. So, so this make possible to identify some determinants, and then to do prevention. I know that we pass the message to architects. If you are building a house, please do not put a door between the garage and the house. Maybe it's not very convenient for the people living there, but or put a door very tight, but because to avoid any contamination. So this helps to identify determinants. Having an observatory and repeating measurement over times makes it possible to identify the new compounds of interest, and on the contrary, the compounds that there is no need to measure anymore. For example, over the 20 years of the observatory, we observe a decrease in concentration of chlorinated compounds, perchloroethylene or trichloroethylene. Over time, the indoor concentration decrease. So today, we consider it's not necessary anymore to look at these compounds in indoor air. Measurements are expensive, so if you can avoid measuring things that you will never detect, it's better. So chlorinated compounds are disappearing. On the contrary, we observed over the 20 years an increase in terpene concentration, limonene, pinene, and we think it's due to the fragrances. We use more and more fragrances in chemical cleaning products or air fresheners. So this helps to identify the new emerging compounds. So it helps for knowledge, but it helps also for policymakers. In the dwelling survey, we identify a group of VOC that were measured in many dwellings. And coming from building material. That's why the French government decided to have a mandatory labeling scheme on building material and decoration products. So now in France, you have a label on carpets, on paint, on varnish. When you want to paint your bedroom, you can buy there is a label from A+, low emission, of these 10 VOCs to C, high emission or not evaluated in a lab. So this provided information for policymakers to make the regulation evolve. Based on the basis of the measurement we did in school the French government decided to implement a regulation to measure indoor air quality in schools. That's why since last year, it's now mandatory. As soon as you have an energy retrofit or you have a new extension of a building, a big event in a building, you need to do some measurements. Not all compounds, only formaldehyde, benzene, and CO2. And every year you need to check the windows and the ventilation system, if any, to be sure that the air change rate is okay. So an observatory provide knowledge, but also provide clear elements for policymakers to be able to have science-based decision. And I will say that it also provides information for to raise awareness, and the observatory had also the role to make flyer for general public, to communicate to general public in newspaper. So having this observatory makes more visible the topic and provide useful information on indoor air pollution for everybody, for the general population. And I know that not in France, but in Germany, the observatory and the campaign they are performing only in dwellings are associated to human biomonitoring, measurement in urine and blood. So in Germany, they are able to quantify, to identify the contribution of indoor pollution to human exposure. They are measuring either semi-volatile organic compounds or lead, for example, are measured. And if you add to your observatory health questionnaire, we have this make possible to have an EPI studies. And during the French first housing survey, we did measurements in dwellings, but people also had a questionnaire to fill in, reporting asthma and COPD and allergies. And we identified that the more VOC they had with high concentration, the more risk they had to have asthma or other respiratory diseases. So,
was there any coordination? Was there any coordination with academic institutions with the observatory to say coordinate research or to stop siloing or duplication? Because that seems to me to be one of the other values. Is that air quality in academia has seen an explosion. You know, there's never been more studies being produced than there are right now on indoor air quality, but there seems to be a lack of coordination sometimes, or duplication or siloing. And I can imagine an observatory having a very positive impact on that.
Exactly. Yeah, the French observatory was collaborating and is still collaborating with universities to either to develop analytical techniques or to do some analysis, chemical analysis, or to do some statistical analysis. Yes, and there is a scientific committee with academic people, and the studies are discussed, and there is a good coordination to avoid overlap with some studies. And I know also that there is an indoor air quality observatory in New Zealand, and this is also a group of all the institutes and universities trying to coordinate their efforts. The budget are limited, so it's good to be efficient and to coordinate and not to duplicate, as you say. So in New Zealand, the observatory has this objective to coordinate and to organize, to be more powerful altogether.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the question has to be asked: why doesn't every country have one? And that's probably the first question. Probably the more realistic question I had for you is, what was it? I mean, if you were to describe the observatory, is it a government department? Is it attached to a particular research organization? Is it a big, heavy thing to manage, a costly thing to have within it? I mean, is it possible to describe what it is as an entity, an observatory, or what your experience of it was in France, at least?
It is expensive. That's why it's difficult. You need money. For example, the nationwide survey, the first dwelling survey was about 7 million euro to collect all the data and then to analyze all the data and to do all the statistical analysis over a course of 10 years, maybe. So for 1 year and for all the people working on the survey, it's not so much. But at the end, it was several million euro. The school survey costs more than 10 million euro. And the second dwelling survey was about 7 million euros also. So it's very expensive. Yeah, that's why it does not exist in all the countries. So the first limitation is maybe the money. The second, maybe the first actually, is the political wish. If you want an observatory supported by public money, you need to convince the government, politicians and people in the ministries need to be convinced that it's important. And sometimes it's not easy to convince people. People really think of outdoor air pollution. This is visible, the car exhaust, industries. We speak a lot about water quality also, but indoor air pollution is not really well known. We know in our group of people working on the topic the importance of this issue, but once you make a step back, you realize that in environmental sciences, indoor air quality is not really well known in science, even among academics, and so among policymakers even more. So, and same in the general public or building owners. So you need to convince the politicians, but when they are convinced, they can do nice things, and that's what happened in France. The government, when it was built in 2001, there was a politician really wanted to make things move, and if there is this political wish, then you can find the money. So maybe the first is the political wish, and then the budget. And this is hard to maintain the budget over a long period. We were discussing the epidemiological studies that are long and expensive. This is the same for building an observatory. Is long. The campaign are long. So sometimes the politicians want the results the day after. So it's not possible. It's a long process. So
or at least within a political cycle, they want the results.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
It's not at least in France, it's not a department in the ministries. There were 3 ministries: environment, health, and housing, supporting the Scientific and Technical Center for Buildings, CSTB. That CSTB was mandated to implement this observatory, and there was a yearly contract with the ministries with money and with the decision. Every year it was decided, okay, next year you're doing that, you are housing survey or you're analyzing this data. And CSTB was coordinating this observatory with a lot of partners, academics, public or private labs, and statisticians, psychologists, a group of people around doing the job.
And size-wise, I mean, how many people at its biggest and smallest was the observatory?
We were a team between 10 and 15 people at technicians, because when you are carrying out a nationwide survey, everywhere you must have the same equipment, same protocols. So there was a technical team looking for equipment, testing the equipment, calibrating the equipment, training the teams on site, on field. So there is this technical team. Then there are the project leaders, one person in charge of dwellings, one person in charge of offices, schools, one person in charge of ventilation topic, having a cross-cutting advice on all the studies on ventilation. Then we had one data manager. It's important to have data manager. We mentioned the database and the importance of having clean data, reliable data. So having a data manager is mandatory. And then you need statisticians to do the statistical analysis. And we had sometimes a communication person with us to help for the dissemination. This is also important to disseminate, not to have useful knowledge, not knowledge for knowledge, but knowledge for policymakers, for general public, for other scientists. So it varies over time depending on the budget, between 10 and 15%.
And was that big enough? Did it always feel like it was a drop in the ocean of what it should be, or did it feel like you were making good progress? Like, is that 15 people doesn't seem like a lot of people for the single biggest environmental risk we face, you know?
Yes. Then there were more people in our, we calculated that the number of people contributed to working group and committees were about 100. Not working full time, but punctually contributing to this observatory. So 15, it's not bad. I would say it's good, but it's not a lot. You're right, but we had local teams also that subcontractors on site to do the sampling, and private or public labs doing the chemical analysis or biological analysis. So 15 permanent staff, but many people are working around partly for the observatory. And so it's not bad compared to other countries. I would say we were lucky in France having this.
Yeah, for sure.
This is true compared to outdoor air quality, where there are many state monitoring stations and people in all the region. This is true that compared to outdoor air quality, it's not a lot of money, and neither a lot of people working on that topic. While we spend 90%, 85% of our time in building.
Yeah, well, I mean, not to get too tropey, because we've said that ad nauseum on the podcast, but the vast majority of our exposure to even outdoor air occurs indoors, and it changes indoors. So we do need to know so much more about it. Is it an awkward question to ask? Do you have any sense of how much it costs a year to run a observatory? Do you know, was it a public budget for
it was only public? Yeah, it was only public, and still only public. It was about 2 million euro every year. So
really,
paying for the surveys and paying for the people. It's reasonable. Yeah, to my opinion, it's reasonable. But even 2 million was sometimes hard to collect.
Yeah, I was having this argument the other day. There are major universities in London that would spend that on research a year on indoor air quality and not even miss a heartbeat. So at a national level, that's not even...
It's reasonable.
Doesn't even register, which is a shame, because I imagine the return on investment of something like an observatory is almost incalculable from my biased perspective.
It's because it's not calculable. It was hard to show sometimes the added value. We try to assess the cost of indoor air pollution in France. In 2014, we assessed that for 6 indoor air pollutants, including radon, by the way, we calculated that it costs. It is associated to 20,000 additional premature deaths every year, and 28 new cases of new diseases, and a cost of 19 billion euro every year because of. So the cost can be calculated because you have health cost. When you're sick, you go to hospital and you have drugs that cost, but may also due to the cost of life. When you die prematurely, not at the life expectancy at about 80 years old. When you die earlier, you lose some years of life, and these years of life cost to the society.
Economists have a cost. Yeah,
give a value of human life, and based on this value of human life, we were able to calculate based on the diseases, the mean age at which you die prematurely. If you are sick, if you have a lung cancer, if you have there was carbon monoxide poisoning, also leukemia in our study. Depending on the mid-age and the number of people who die, we were able to calculate the years of life lost at a country level, and then to transform this in euro based on the cost of human life. So that's why we came to this figure of 19 billion euro. That is a lot, of course.
Yeah, and I think that's
only for 6 indoor pollutants for which we had enough data regarding exposure on one side and health effect on the other side, and quantitative relationship between exposure and health effect.
Sounds very similar to the kind of work that Ben Jones and Max Sherman were doing with the DALIs and these kind of 5 or 6 major pollutants, none of which are a surprise to anybody in indoor air quality. But nonetheless, we can be pretty sure that a fairly defined group of pollutants are causing a vast majority of the trouble. And I think that's half the challenge sometimes in communicating this risk, is that the costs at a national level, or the DALI impacts, the disability adjusted life years, are all so eye-watering that it makes it difficult, or strangely, to pitch a 2 million quid a year cost of maintaining something, where even having a small impact on the UK is 20 billion a year. I think the US is 150 billion a year cost to early death, disability, healthcare costs, all of these kinds of things. it would appear like it's an absolute slam dunk to invest 20, 30, 100 million in flipping observatories and research and trying to sort this stuff out, because the return on investment to society would be so enormous.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is not the same we're paying. If you ask a building manager to invest in low emission material products, it will cost for this person. But if people are sick in 20 years, he will not pay. So this is not the same people who are paying. So that's why some building manager are reluctant to invest in indoor air quality, because they are not the one who will pay. They will sell the building, and then it will not be their problem if people are sick in a few years, or if people are not productive. That's why that's what we are told. It's important to show these figures, but sometimes it does not convince people because they are not paying. And value of life is also something very intangible.
And this is why I think within things like the observatory, the communications department is so important, because how we communicate risk, how we change habits and behavior and perception of risk, particularly with something that's often so long-term and chronic in its outcomes, is so critical.
We do not need to scare people. Also, it is true that when we speak about indoor air pollution, we spend a lot of time in buildings. The concentration are higher than outdoors. We are exposed through inhalation, but also thermal contact and ingestions. There are thousands of chemicals. At the end, people are scared, and if you are scared, sometimes you don't act because they are too scary. So we need to have communication is very important, and collaboration with human sciences people is also important to find a good way to communicate and engage people instead of frightening people.
Yeah, and like you say, the complexity is a challenge in its own right. I mean, you mentioned something there which I meant to pick up earlier, which we didn't, and that was that, what is an air quality risk can become a dust risk and a thermal risk and an ingestion risk, and like risks change over time and in the process as well. Had Charles Weschler on, the ozone air chemistry guy, and boy, does air chemistry get complicated quickly. You were talking about limonene and pinene, which by themselves aren't necessarily very harmful, but put them in contact with ozone, and boy, do they turn into some nasty things quickly.
Exactly.
I think that's half the challenge, is that it's not the fact that it's chemistry or that it's air quality. It's just the fact that there's so much to comprehend, that I think people just shut down ultimately. And if you can't translate that meaningfully into levers that people can control to have an impact on an outcome, they lose the sense of direction very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really hard.
Yes, when we say people open the window to remove your indoor air pollutants, but we know that some particles are also coming from outdoor air if outdoor air is polluted. So people can be lost. That's why we need clear messages and to really help people and motivate them.
So what's the IRSN then, and what's your role in that today?
So IRSN is the French Institute for Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety. We are working on ionizing radiation and effects on humans through epidemiological studies. So we are working, of course, on radon, natural radioactivity, but we are also working on health effects due to ionizing radiation at the workplaces. So nuclear workers are exposed, some medical workers are also exposed to ionizing radiation, and space attendants, flight attendants, people. When we are flying in a plane, we are exposed to cosmic rays, and so as passenger, it's a short exposure, and because we are not in a plane every day. But for the people working in airplanes, there are some studies showing that it could have effects on cancer in flight attendants. So we have a cohort of about 50,000 flight attendants for which this cohort is starting. It's a retrospective cohort. It means we will not follow them in the coming years. We are trying to assess their past exposure, and looking if today those who are dying or were sick because of cancer or other diseases it could be due to their past exposure, and their past exposure is assessed based on if they were flying on a short distance flight or long distance. If you are a long distance flight, you are higher in the sky, so you're more exposed to cosmic rays. So this is a retrospective cohort. So you're looking at the exposure back and trying to see if the diseases. We don't need to wait 20 years or more so that they declare a disease. They have already been exposed, and so we are collecting the cause of death for those who are dead, and
you're in a big metal tube in the sky for most of your working life, so like it's quite a defined set of confounding factors. You're unlikely to be a flight attendant and a radiological nurse at the same time. So I guess if you are seeing health effects from ionization, potentially you can be pretty sure where that's come from if you're dealing with a flight attendant. I think ozone's another one, isn't it?
They're also exposed to night shift and jet lags, and we know that jet lags, night shift, can also disturb the health, and so they have co-exposure. They have also other
and ozone. Charles Weschler was saying more ozone up high as well potentially. So
there is what we call the fume events, some chemical contamination in airplanes that is not well understood now, but they could also be exposed to some chemicals sometimes. So so we have also these occupational cohorts, and the third group of people we are looking at are the people who undergone radiotherapy. When you have cancer, you have radiotherapy that kills the tumor, but today we are more and more healing from cancer. We are not dying anymore from cancer. So the survival rate is good, is improving. But then you could have health effects, and when you have a breast cancer, you could have effects on the heart. Our heart is exposed to ionizing radiation, so that's why we are looking also at side effects of radiotherapy to better understand these side effects and to try to find the best dose, enough to kill the tumors, but not too high to save the healthy tissues around the tumors. So we also have these cohorts in our.
And are you sitting across all of those studies, Corinne, or do you focus on one particular area?
No, I'm coordinating. We are a group of 25 person. Epidemiologists and data managers, statisticians working on all these cohorts.
Wow. And you mentioned you're doing an interesting one on radon, a very large cohort radon study. Tell us a little about that, because actually radon isn't something I've spoken about much on the podcast. Actually, I must get James McGrath on to talk about radon, because Ireland struggles with radon quite significantly.
James is a big expert in Ireland.
Radon. Tell us about the radon study you're doing.
So this is called the Coral project. This is part of the Constance cohort. So Constance is a large population cohort in France, 220,000 of people recruited 10 years ago. So we are assessing the radon exposure over their life, because all the participants in our cohort provided all the places where they live across their life. So we are able to, when they were kids, we will assess radon concentration based on the cities they were, based on the radon potential in the soil. We cannot do measurement in the dwellings where they were living 30 years ago. So we based on all the dwellings they lived in, we will assess the radon exposure over the life and assess this radon exposure with the diseases that they declare, lung cancer also. But the idea is also to look at other type of cancer, because it is established that radon is associated to lung cancer, but it's still not really clear if radon could be associated to leukemia, because the bone marrow could be also exposed to ionizing radiation after radon exposure. And there is also suspicion of skin cancer due to radon. So other type of cancer and other type of diseases, such as neurological diseases, could also be associated to radon. We are about to publish a new meta-analysis where collecting all the data on radon and health effect, and that's why we perform these cohort studies to study the association between radon exposure over the course of the life because the case control studies were mainly done in adulthood, not including childhood. So we want to see if the exposure during childhood may have a contribution. So this is ongoing. We should have the results in 1 or 2 years. We have collected all the data collected, and we are now about to analyze, to treat statistically all this data.
And is there assumption that you can be a more vulnerable group with something like radon as well? Like the young, are they likely to be more affected collectively?
It has not been observed for radon yet, but it's known that the children are more vulnerable to ionizing radiation, more vulnerable to chemicals as well, because they are young. As you say, the tissues and organs are not totally mature, and compared to adults and compared to the body weight, children are more exposed. They inhale more air, they eat more food, they drink more water. If we divide by the body weight compared to adults, so they are more exposed and they are more vulnerable because they are still under development. So we know that children are more radiosensitive than adults, but it has not been showed on radon, because most of the epidemiological studies on radon were made on adults and just collecting the past exposure, but not going back into the childhood of people.
Yeah. We spoke about this before. Kids tend to eat dust and be exposed to all sorts of stuff, so they tend to overexpose themselves to all sorts of things.
I forgot to mention this, that they have specific behavior. They are crawling on the floor. They are touching their mouth with their hands. Specific behavior that expose them more to, for example, to chemical compounds, semi-volatile organic compounds. We were mentioning phthalates in dust or polybrominated flame retardant. It has been shown that for some of these compounds, the major pathway of exposure is in ingestion for children.
Yeah.
And in this cohort study where we will study radon, we try to assess the radiological exposome. You may have discussed what is exposome during the podcast with other people. So exposome is all the exposure across our life from birth and even in utero before to death, all type of exposure, environmental exposure, but also social exposure behaviors. So this is the exposome, as there is the genome describing all our genes. The pending concept is exposome. It was proposed by Christopher Weil in 2005. So we are trying to assess the radiological exposome. This is all the exposure to ionizing radiation from birth to adulthood to now. So this is radon, natural radiation, but we also assess the human anthropic radiation. So the fallout from Chernobyl and for nuclear tests, we still have a very low contamination of the environment, but still a contamination. So we are assessing this and assessing exposure through medical when you are doing a CT scan or a radiology, radio. You are exposed to X-rays, ionizing radiation. So we are asking to these people all the medical exposure exams they had from the childhood to now. And for those who were exposed professionally, we will know which type of job they had in the past, if they were a nuclear worker or flight attendants or a medical worker. So we will assess all the routes of exposure to ionizing radiation, and at the end have a total cumulative dose from birth to now, and see if there is association with diseases, cancer and non-cancer diseases. So this is what we call the radiological exposome.
Shows you learn something new every day. I've not actually heard exposome before. I mean, I've heard the microbiome and things like that, but the exposome makes some sense. The cumulative exposure. And does it tend to talk about one particular pollutant and your total exposure to it, or could it be a collection of pollutants? All pollutants.
Physical, chemical, biological, and also so your close environment, but also your social interaction. We know that the social environment is also important for health. So exposome is really including all these risk factors, and also the positive ones. If you are exposed to green spaces have been shown to be positive for health effect, and if you are living in the city where you can walk, it's positive for your health. So exposome is really the understanding of all what expose people from birth to adulthood, and association with health. Yeah, it's a new concept more and more. When we were mentioning that we need to break the silos, the objective of exposome is really to make people think larger than only one chemical or only radon or only a virus. It's to make people think that, okay, we're exposed to a large amount of many factors, physical factors, but so the exposome is a very new concept, but so it's hard to qualify the exposome of people. That's why the scientists are looking at radiological exposome or indoor exposome. Indoor exposome is what you're exposed to indoors, including the microbiome. And there are people working on urban exposome. Urban exposome is outdoor air pollution in cities, plus noise in cities, plus the fact that it's very dense. You cannot walk. So there are some. There are studies on children exposome. You're only looking at what is the exposure of children, chemicals and the food you're eating. So it was Christopher Wilde who invented this concept in 2005. Was the director of the IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer. So he developed.
That's interesting.
To make people think larger, to open to be more open-minded, and including social exposome and social science.
Yeah,
and this is why human biomonitoring is developing, because it's hard to describe all the exposure from birth to now. That's why looking at what we have in our blood, in our urine, is more and more used, because we imagine that if we were exposed during our life to these pollutants, for those who are persistent, they are still in our, or if we are chronically exposed, they are not persistent, but we are chronically exposed to them, such as phthalate. We can measure them in our blood and urine. That's why it's developing a lot in Europe, but also in US. It started in US with the NANES studies, where a group of Americans were sampled every couple of years, measuring hundreds of chemicals in their blood and urine. And we mentioned the low-cost sensors and cheap and inexpensive techniques, but on the opposite side, we have the non-target analysis that are developing, the NTA. I don't know if you have heard about these techniques. So to now, when we were looking for benzene, we had to know that we want to measure benzene in this building, and we were having the analytical sampling and then analysis to detect benzene. So we were very blind, because if you don't know that there is a chemical, you are not looking at it, you are not developing the sampling and the analysis. We discussed about the lamppost effect.
I was going to say, we had a conversation about this. I remember
we had a conversation about that. So the idea of this new NTA, non-target analysis, is that you have no limits. You look at you take everything in your net. You take, and you are able to discover quantities of chemicals. And with both gas chromatography and liquid chromatography, when you combine both techniques, you are able to. So now it's with such techniques, it's not 10 VOCs that you measure in the air. This is thousands, and so it's very expensive. It's very new, so it's not used as routine. So it can be used for environmental samples, dust or air, and also for urine and blood. So it's a way to assess exposome. If you are looking at with this non-target analysis in urine or blood, you discover many compounds. And this was first tested in Europe by Pavel Rotkowski in Norway. He measured with these techniques settled dust samples, and he identified more than 2,000 chemicals in settled dust samples in dwellings. So it was dust. But now it's used at EU level in blood samples. So it's blood exposome in a way. You have all the marker. But so it's challenging because analytically it's quite hard and expensive. And then you have a massive amount of data. You have also some statistical issue to be able to address and to manage all this amount of data. So it is not simple, but it's very promising. I also to be able to describe our exposome.
Yeah, because I mean, to very briefly explain the lamppost effect, it's a story about somebody looking for their keys under a lamppost, and somebody asks them, "Why are you looking for your keys there?" And he says, "Because I lost them over there, but it's dark and I can't see, so I'm looking where I can see." And we talk about that in the context of air quality, because we know from experience that pollutants keep bad company. And if we're looking at one pollutant, we could be assuming a health outcome that's toxicologically, I guess, being caused by something else. It just happens to be keeping bad company, and we're missing parts of the jigsaw puzzle. So generally speaking, when we're doing these speciated air quality tests, we're looking at 10 or 20 or maybe even a few more, but there are hundreds and thousands potentially in and around us. But we have to balance that equally with as interesting as that is, does it help us get a better outcome? And if we look at studies like Ben's and Max's, if we find that 75% of all the harm is coming from particulate matter, are we better off just focusing in on that? Or is it the fact that particulate matter is keeping bad company we don't know about? You know, this is the fun thing, I suppose, is trying to unravel that and figure out where this harm is being created and improve our understanding of it.
Exactly. I don't say that in the future we need to measure everything with this NTA techniques, but this will help to improve knowledge and maybe to focus on some specific compounds that are associated to human health effects.
Yeah. And if nothing else, it will keep the PhD students busy for the next couple of decades.
Absolutely. There are still a lot to do in our field.
For sure. So where do you see it kind of heading then over the next 5 years, Corinne, from a epidemiological perspective? Is there a shortage of epidemiologists? Is it a sector that needs to be 10 times as big? Is there advances in science you think are coming? Where does your field go over the next kind of 5 to 10 years, do you think?
Yeah, you're mentioning a shortage of epidemiologists. This is true that we have more and more difficulties to find students because students quite smart in mathematics or data science are more going to finance financial issues, studies, or to AI. So we have, but we are working on a nice object. This is human health, so that's why we can motivate young researchers to join us because of this. This makes sense. What we are doing makes sense because we try to understand the human health effect. So. And as we were discussing, more and more diseases are increasing. Cancer or other neurodegenerative diseases are also increasing. We need to understand if there is an environmental cause, if there are environmental causes. So our studies are with all the new models, the new studies, new techniques with AI, or the new way to measure exposure. This will expand for sure in the future, and we have also societal requests. People are more and more aware of environmental impact. So people are requesting more data. I hope. Maybe I'm biased because I'm working in the field, but I have the feeling that there is a societal demand to better understand the influence of the environment or the influence of our work on our health. So, and we need science in a more general. We need science to provide elements for our policymakers. With COVID crisis, we observe that there is high risk that people are taking decisions with not science based, and more and more people are propagating fake information. So we need really science and good science and information, factual information, factual data to help policymakers to take their decision. This is important to keep the science at a high level in the future. I believe that this is not the only element for decision. There are also, of course, economic issues or societal issues, but this is part of the elements that policymakers need to make their decision. Evidence-based knowledge to improve the health of the people.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So I hope epidemiology will help in that sense.
Corinne, thanks so much for spending a couple of hours talking to me today.
Simon.
It's been brilliant. Really enjoyed it. It's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for listening. Before you go, can I ask a favour? If you enjoyed the podcast and know someone else who might be interested, please spread the word and let's keep building this community. This podcast was brought to you in partnership with 21 Degrees, Lindab, ACO, Ultra Protect, and Imbiot. All great companies who share the vision of the podcast and are not here by accident. Your support of them helps their support of this podcast. Do check them out in the links and at airqualitymatters.net.